I'm waiting for the recording button to come up, but it hasn't. So it's my pleasure to welcome Jeremy and to share with you all that about 3 years ago, I read a wonderful book, and this is the book. I don't know whether you can see it. Working with Nature by Jeremy Purseglove. This book inspired me in many, many ways. It inspired me to invite Jeremy to our summer school and to write a chapter for our new book, Building Biodiversity. It is full of wonderful stories of working with nature from this country and from all over the world, because Jeremy has travelled everywhere, it seems to me, as a water engineer and as an environmentalist. And I think it's wonderful that he could bring those two disciplines together to work for the environment through his knowledge of water engineering and science in general. He was a pioneer in helping to reduce flooding in our country particularly and around the world by looking at the idea which we know about now but didn't when he was first working on it, the idea of working with the river and not fighting the river and stopping the river, but working with it. And in so many ways, he's pioneered this cooperation and partnership with nature. He's produced wildflower meadows, beautiful forests all over the world, and he's written very importantly about the importance of preserving natural life and bringing that into our everyday lives here and around the world. Palm oil is a good example of this. Palm oil can be grown sustainably, and we have examples in the book of that. There's a wonderful chapter called The Chocolate Forest, which is very enticing. So the book is there, but we have Jeremy with us tonight. We're very privileged. Thank you so much, and we look forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That's very kind of you. I'm glad you said about not fighting the river, because that's the whole point of it. So I'm a landscape architect and ecologist, now retired. And I spent my life, I started off seriously in the water industry and then moved to an engineering consultancy. By the way, if you don't hear me loud enough, please all shout. I always say this at a normal lecture. Same applies on this. If I seem to mumble, just shout. So I've had a brilliant life doing all this kind of stuff. I am going to talk tonight about two main things which are the central to what I've done always, and that is the impact of what the civil engineers do to landscapes and habitats, and also what land use, more importantly, does, because land use is the real thing that clobbers more or less everything, whatever you're doing. And so there's bound to be quite a lot about farming in that respect. So that's the picture. Would you like to put on the presentation, Matt? Is that it? Is that all I need to? It's quite small on my screen. Not that bothers me. Do we need to make
for everybody else?
Can they see a full picture?
Full screen.
It's showing half the screen is Matt King.
Okay.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's what I'd had as well.
How's that, Francis?
That's better. That's fabulous.
Great.
Okay. So So it's climate, that's fine. So I'll kick off with this. And every time I need to shift it, I'll say to Matt next, and he'll fly on to the next one. So the title of the lecture is As the title of my book. Before I forget, is easily available. I'm sure you can get it for pence on Amazon nowadays. It came out 2 or 3 years ago. So we're talking about climate, clearly, as well as engineering and land use. And here we are on a beautiful day in the Northern Caribbean, blissful heaven. Next one. Next one. But there's trouble afoot. There you have the lifted boards from a hurricane. And the hurricanes have been storming in. There's always been hurricanes in the Caribbean. Columbus weathered a small one when he discovered them. But they've been getting worse and worse. And we know that that is as a result of climate change. I went out to the Bahamas. Sounds very luxurious, but actually it was far from it in the circumstances. After Hurricane Floyd arrived in 1999, and I was sent out to do the environmental side of the damage assessment. Next one. Brilliant, thanks. And I must say, I've seldom seen anything more shocking in all my life. What happened, the wave just came sweeping through. You know, you get the tremendous winds, but then you get the backwash of the raised seas, which come in. And the place was absolutely knocked to bits. This house is an example. I was with somebody who stood on the rubble of his destroyed house, holding his child above him as the waves came up to his chin. And I've seldom seen anything more the power of nature and the destructiveness of this event was shocking. Next one. But the worst thing was the impact on people, and particularly the poorer people. I went along in the capital area, to a place called the Mud. That was a good name for it. It was where the Haitian refugees, a lot of the underclass in the Bahamas have come from Haiti in small boats, and they are the classic underclass refugee boat people. And they are used to do all the least exciting jobs to keep the place going. And this place, the Mud, was in a filled-in harbour, which isn't a very promising place to be living. And when the wave came through, it just destroyed the whole place. And there were turtles in people's houses, and there was an adjacent graveyard, and the graveyard was churned up by the wave and was dropping coffins and bodies into the area of the houses. It was terrible. I went to the Prime Minister of the Bahamas then, and it was, I said, for God's sakes, you know, this needs dealing with. Can you sort it out? And he said yes, but he didn't. And then many years later, the next hurricane came, and the same thing happened all over again. So, you know, the first lesson you learn about climate change and terrible weather is it's actually the poor which get the worst treatment. And indeed, they had been rebuilt opposite to what I suggested back in their horrible little harbour. Next one. So we're talking more about the power of nature. This is the Oxus, as in classical tales of the ancient Greeks and so on, Alexander and people. It is now known as the Pyanj. And over in the distance are the mountains of Afghanistan. And this in the foreground is the puny attempt by the engineers to stop the river getting out of control, which is pretty pointless. They may be taller than a man, these blocks, but they are like little tumbled dice. And the river here is 10 miles wide and formidable. And it was, you know, it breaks bridges, sinks cranes, unmakes islands. You've seldom seen anything more powerful, power of nature, breathtaking. Next one. Indeed, so much so that villages have been cut off, and they're now getting off to the shops and into town by this way, which is a fairground ride that they found somewhere attached to a cable over this terrifying flood. So that just gives you that sense of the power of nature. Next one. And so it hasn't just been overseas. We've obviously had tremendous flooding. I wrote 30 years ago a book called Taming the Flood, and it's still in print, to my amazement, updated. Because one thing about writing about floods, it's like writing about Christmas. You kind of, it always comes around again, and it certainly has, with tremendous enthusiasm as the climate change starts to cut in. So you've got all these floods, 2015, 2019, 2020. Well, now I've run out of examples to put on the bottom of the picture of the number we've had since. And of course, even this autumn, serious flooding in Wales. And where I live, all the river valley bottoms have gone underwater. So it's the Environment Agency boys, the people I used to work with, have been kept extremely busy. Next one. And so the way that they have traditionally dealt with it, and this is what I encountered when I started as an innocent little chap in 1977 in the Severn Trent Water Authority, what they traditionally did was they got enormous, and they still do to a large extent, enormous machines like this, and they rip the heart out of the river in order to make the flows go faster and faster. And you can see the result is with us, with many trapezoidally shaped, channelized rivers all over the place. But certainly that was full on when I turned up. And next one. So this is a strange picture, but it explains things. It's Millet's painting of Ophelia, the drowning Ophelia in Hamlet. Basically, the Pre-Raphaelites were very good at observing nature. They used to take their easels out into the meadows. This was painted from life, the river in Surrey. The thing to look at then is that forget the lady in the stream for the moment. Just look at the habitat. So on the top left is a big willow tree falling into the stream. Then you've got a dog grows with white flowers that will hang over the river and catch all the supermarket trolleys and branches and dead dogs and form another kind of blockage. Then to the top right, there's a rather bedraggled looking teasel plant, which thrives on eroded banks. And that's an eroded bank. So what you see is the river is moving. Their rivers are always moving, and it's moving out to take away the land on the bank on the other side. So you can imagine the farmer standing on the top of the bank saying to the engineer, "It's going off my land, this river, put it back, case it up." And then down at the bottom, there is the aquatic plants, the branch burreed on the left and the water crowfoot beside Ophelia. And they all hold the water up. So when the flood comes, it's all ready to be worse. So I stepped into this situation, conflict of values, when I arrived in the Water Board as their first environmentalist. And I was rung up one bright day, very soon after I started, by a chap who said he was a river engineer. I had never heard there was such a thing. I wasn't totally unprepared for this. I thought I'd be planting trees around offices and dealing with some reservoirs. So basically, this river business, he said, "I'm a river engineer, and I hear you're our new green chap. Well, would you come out and help me? I've got a lady tied to a tree. It's the bottom of her garden. The river goes through the bottom, and she is refusing to be untied because she says she wants to keep the tree. And if she doesn't go, I won't be able to cut it down, and she will be flooded, and it will serve her right." So that was what I went out to find. And that was the day my life changed, because then we started to look at the way in which things could be different. Next one. So here, if you remember the picture of the yellow digger wiping everything out, this was what we started to work on as a different way of doing it. This is a machine still there, still doing a job, but actually transplanting water forget-me-not to put it into the margins of the edge with a wider margin on the edge. And so we evolved. We looked at it together. You didn't have to flatten everything, but there were some trees that were in the way, and he had to lower the water level a bit, otherwise it would flood. So you increase the capacity of the stream. But there were tons of things that could be done to kind of make it not a brutal drain. And it was all about definitions. So suddenly you were looking at what a river means. To the engineer, it was a drainage channel. It had to get the cubic meters of water off the land, away from the houses and away. But of course, to everybody else, including the lady who had protested, it was all about beauty and picnics and the wind in the willows and wildlife and all those other things. So you suddenly had this collision of values. We don't want to be flooded, but we don't want to lose all this lovely habitat. So that was the moment when everything changed for me, and I learned on the hoof. We all learned together, and we found that we could keep trees on one side of the bank, that we could do wider margins for wildflowers. Then instead of putting the dredgings all in the ponds, because that was a way of getting rid of them, because the idea was for making the farmers more productive, we would actually make a new pond with this marvelous machine. And on the flood banks, grow cowslips, and the whole thing kind of tailored and adapted to a wider brief. And that really took off, because it was a good story. That really took off and became a different way of doing things, which has continued to this day, really. Next one. Oh, and the main thing I should say about that, so the lesson, there was back again. Yeah, and the lesson was there were two ways of doing it. You could do it badly, the horrible straightened channel, or you could do it sensitively and imaginatively and spend money. And you could also persuade people. I had to persuade the landowners, and I found the farmers were not all into filling in every pond, because they quite like to shoot at the occasional duck. There were things you could do by persuasion that you just made it in it well rather than badly. Okay, next one. Sorry, Matt. So there were in the end, this is a German example, the things got more and more ambitious. This is an old straightened channel, and they were putting the entire river back into regime, into bends, and make it exquisitely lovely. But of course, take lots of more land, but then you start to find that there are people who are willing to do that. So really reversing the whole thing of engineering development. Next one. And so basically, this is the latest thing that's come in the last few years. Natural flood management is the word, NFM, and it's the darling of many engineers, but not all of them keen on it yet. Honeycutt, the place at the top, Holnicote or Honeycutt, is an estate owned by the National Trust. On the edges of Exmoor, facing out into Bridgewater Bay, the north side of that bit of countryside. And it's owned by the National Trust, and they own the whole estate, because there's a very small catchment, they own the whole river from the top up here right down to the sea, which is why it was the pioneering example to see how they could do this NFM, natural flood management. They started at the top, and they, excuse me, the moorlands had previously, they put grips in the moorlands because everyone was after the usual thing, more farming, more food, more profit. And so that was for more sheep on the moorland. So the thing was to sponge it up, reduce the drainage off the tops instead of doing what they used to do. And that meant that was a huge area of stored water when the rain came. And then on they went further down. Next one. So yes, this is a man called Nigel Hester, and he was the National Trust guy. And he was in the powerful position of being able to work with all his tenants. This is a tenant farmer. And they, by persuasion, and also it didn't half help the persuasion because they were prepared to and powerful enough to basically reduce the rent a bit for the farmers. They could persuade them to sacrifice a certain amount of land. They're having sponged it up at the top. In the middle section, not shown here, where it was going through a kind of gorge and deep valley, they deliberately, exact opposite of what my old engineers used to do, were putting trees and branches across the stream. So it impeded it in this narrow bit. And then most importantly, at the bottom, they removed the flood banks. That's something I haven't got a picture of, but you have these raised banks on either side of the river to keep it inside the bank to send it scooting further down. And what that did is it went straight past the farmland that was kept dry and landed on the towns and villages further down. So by persuasion again, they removed the flood banks. What that meant was the farmer, and this is now happening in earnest all over the country, including near where I live, couldn't really grow cereal crops. That's all he had to do. Cereal crops are very profitable, but instead, what they'd always done in the past, and they're doing now much more, are having sheep and cattle. And if the flood's coming, you just take your animals and shoo them out of the lowest bit into the next field above the flood. So the crop moves, it's only livestock. And that's now happening all over the place because farmers are no longer able. But we've had two massive floods in my local river, the Welland, and the cereal farmers are realizing they just can't go on doing this. So when they'd done all this and persuaded everybody, they did a measurement of the whole thing. And on Christmas Eve 2013, they looked at all that was the moment when the next big rainstorm flood came, and they simply it worked. The water lapped up just below to all the houses, and the villagers were saved. And so that's now been adopted elsewhere. The statistic was 160,000 investment saved £30 million worth of property being flooded out, and also a lot of human misery. So there's now a great movement there to kind of adapt the whole thing and look at the possibilities. Next one. That was the River Aller, by the way. So much for rivers. Oh, back there. This is another one that I was much involved in. Is anyone, I don't know, I won't ask, because, but if you live in Surrey, this is the Devil's Punch Bowl at Hindhead, and not very far from Guildford. And that wound through an area called the Devil's Punch Bowl, which was owned by the National Trust. It was common land. It was a very famous beauty spot, area of outstanding natural beauty, all that kind of stuff. And the old A3 to Portsmouth hammered through it. But because it was also protected, it was also National Nature Reserve, they'd never been able to widen it because of all the restrictions. So the traffic just queued through that area for years. And it also wrecked the surrounding landscape and all that kind of thing. So next one, they actually, the engineers in the Highways Agency, as was, it's now Highways England. I worked with them and they removed the road and they put the new road in a tunnel underneath. Well, in that very precious and pressured spot, what a brilliant lateral thinking thing to do. So that the tarmac was ripped up, soil was spread over it, and next one, it went back to heather and bilberries, and nightjars and birch trees. And to this day, you can now walk where the road was previous to 2003, and just through the heather. And it's marvelous, and people love it. And the traffic's freed up and goes fast underneath. So it's all kind of, so the engineers, the practical engineers who were the wreckers, turned the whole thing round and were the savers of that place, which is marvelous. Next one. So that's the engineering. We'll park that for the moment and look at the land use. So the land use, the biggest land use of everywhere in this country, and actually more or less everywhere else in the world, is agriculture. I think the agriculture is about 80% of land use in Britain. Urban towns may seem large, but they're hardly more than 6 or 7% of, and then there's other. So you're talking about 70 to 80% is farmed. And the farmers are always proud to tell you that they are the guardians of the landscape. So they are, and so they have been. Here is the landscape in Worcestershire, with the Malverns behind, and the lovely mixture of, there's cereals there, and then they're dotted with sheep, and there's soft fruit in the foreground, plenty of trees, lovely hedges, the whole thing, a working landscape that was also beautiful. Next one. However, what happened, especially when I was working in the water industry in the 70s and 80s, but it had been going on since the 60s particularly, and it went on into the 90s, but less so, was the great wave of agribusiness, which was moving that mixed, diverse farming into these enormous, particularly for cereals, fields, which actually did lots of damage to the soil, because the intense ploughing meant all the stuff flowed off down, so that made the rivers flood more. It was a very sad sight. You see those 3 little black pimples in the middle of this enormous field, that those are oak trees that were once part of hedge systems. No farmer would plant a tree like that in the middle of his productive field, but they've kind of accidentally been forgotten and left. And so that tells you that this has been turned into a vast agribusiness prairie. And there's so little life in it that really a town would be a great improvement. People talk about the awful things about building on the green belt. But if you've got green belt under intensive agribusiness, towns would be an improvement, certainly for wildlife, where you've got hedgehogs in gardens and birds in trees, and butterflies on the flowers, etc. So basically, it's the worst of the worst, the monoculture. Next one. Doesn't have to be like that. You can do it well or badly. This is the Allerton project near where I live, and it's run by the I can't remember the Game Conservancy, and they were left it, and they do a profitable cereal farm, but show it can be done without destroying all the elements that make it a rich habitat as well. You can see this field in the middle of it. Beside it are these margins which they've kept, buffers. The hedges are there, and they use the very stout hedges. They corpus them and use the wood to heat their log burners in the whole project as well. They have beetle banks, which is a place for beetles in the fields, and the beetles then munch all the aphids and things that do the damage. There's a whole lot of strategies, rather like we did with the rivers, to make it a diverse landscape for things like goldfinches and linnets and partridge, as well as productive. And they've shown that it can be done. So there you are, well or badly. Next one. However, though what we've seen there, that last one was a monoculture that has been modified into a diverse system. It's no longer a big cereal field. It's a cereal field with a certain amount of habitat. And I should say that they still use fertilizer, which I think is not a terrible thing to use. Sometimes you have to be practical. Now then, there's a whole other recipe for land management, which is what people often call agroforestry, whereby you have the crop is actually almost integral with the habitat. Not a lot of examples in UK. We'll come to some overseas, but here a good one is your traditional apple orchard, where the sheep grazed beneath the apple trees, and there was wildflowers in the grass beneath, and the whole thing was an integrated system. But it got rarer and rarer because the thing was apples, we were importing them. I mean, where they raised the Cox's Orange Pippin in Middlesex, that farm went under the extended runways of Heathrow Airport in the 50s. And that tells you what happened, because then with the cool chains and the imports, the apples were coming in from overseas, even far away overseas, and the English apple was on the decline. There was a big movement to kind of reverse that, which has been really very helpful. People have apple days. But the best thing that's happened in the last 10, 15 years with orchards in England is the cider business. If you look back on cider, that was a drink that came in those large plastic. Remember those plastic? We still probably can get them, plastic bottles, and it was made of apple concentrate imported from China, and it was cheap. That we all drank it as students because it was the cheapest stuff. And you'll find people on the pavement also drinking it. It's cheap. It was far from delightful. Magners, an Irish company, had an initiative to change cider completely, and they put it into glass bottles and gave it fancy names and had adverts of beautiful young people picnicking in the sunshine, drinking this cider. And suddenly it was chic, and so they were buying it in the London bars and so on. And as a result, the apple industry expanded, not massively, but significantly. And because there was a market for this commodity that had previously been less exciting and depended on imported stuff. So that's a good story. Next one. Now this is if any of you are in Yorkshire, well, Barbara's in Yorkshire, South Yorkshire. These are the peatlands. Now I'm a mad keen gardener. When I was first gardening, I couldn't get enough of peat for my flower beds, and it was magic stuff. But however, the peat was created, as it is everywhere where it occurs, by rotting vegetation in wet swamps. And the big peat places were near Doncaster, Fourmoors and Hatfield Chase. And when I first went to these places, and they'd grown over 3 millennia, the soggy mosses and all that grew and then rotted and grew and rotted, and they rose to a kind of shallow hill of this very deep, luxurious black peat, which is fab if you put it in a flower pot. But when I first came here in the 80s, and it was shown it, I was absolutely astounded. You have to imagine that this, which is what it's like again now, and what it was before, which is cotton grass on this fabulous wetland, was just like a black peat, made of peat airport as far as the eye could see, with huge yellow diggers dredging it all up to put it into grow bags for tomatoes and so on. So we launched the peat campaign, and it took from when I was involved first I think we took off in 1990, and it was 2004 when they finally closed this area for peat use. And since then, we're not so long later, it's all come back, and more things have come back. Wild cranes, the whole thing. Nature is remarkably good if you give it a chance of recovering. And they managed to stop it just in time before they dug all the peat out, in which case you wouldn't have the regeneration of the peat from the growing mosses. You'd only have a thing like a gravel pit. So it was saved in time. Now, the shocking story about that is, when I went back to see it not so long ago, the old peat works that we all reviled was still there. It was surrounded by the National Nature Reserve, being restored fab, but it was still working, and it was bagging up peat that had come in by boat to the port at Goole, which is nearby, and that had all come from Estonia. So in the end of this year or the year after. It's not quite through. Tony, not what's his name, the guy who does all the telly on the gardening. I know him, but I can't remember his name. You know who I mean. Gardener's World chap. He has campaigned, and the peat is now no longer going to be legally available at all in garden centres and such like in the next year or two. But we are from, if it's English, but we are still importing it from the Baltic Sea area. So this is what happens. You find, sophisticated countries solve their own backyard and then wreck somebody else's. That's just life. Next one. Now, moving on again. So we're leaving the British world. Of course, the glamorous rainforest, which we hear about and is so wonderful. Next one. Very big problem, very common problem, slash and burn. This is Trinidad, where I worked, and also Belize, where I was working. And basically, they get cleared. They're not cleared by malevolent monsters. They're very poor people who are looking for a way of living, and they clear it. And there's no way that can be productive for any length of time, that land. They get a couple of years crop off it and move on. So it's what's called slash and burn. So the whole thing, and you can't police it. I mean, the whole business of nature conservation, especially overseas, is you just can't put a fence around it and say keep off. It's not physically possible. When I first went to the Netherlands with a chap who in his youth, and he was an old man then, so we're talking about in the 50s, he was put in charge of the Biesbosch, which is the great wetland, the mouth of the Rhine. He showed me two things: the book of rules, he had to tell everybody what to do, and an X-ray of his broken ribs, because he'd been beaten up. And the point was, you just can't say, go, stop. You've got to find a clever way of doing this. And so this is where we move on. Right, next one. And this is one of the less good things, which is even more difficult, which I have worked on in Borneo and Sumatra and those places, and Papua New Guinea. The most notorious of all, monoculture. Absolutely awful, and lots of rainforest felled. The fires that ignited the destruction of the forests in Indonesia very often started by the people who are basically after the great prize, which is the palm oil. And the land ownership is never clear because people don't have title to land in these kind of places the way we all have our deeds from. And there's the mill as well, highly polluting. Next one. But I got involved with this one, and there were various things one could do. And the first thing was on the outset of a big new estate, and these estates are as big as a small English county. My county, Rutland, is about the size of some of those. Oh no, back, yeah. And so basically, what we set about to do was to preserve a good third of the area, with particularly the riverine forest. So you have to map it and find out the best stuff. And if you followed the streams through these huge areas of forest and get big chunks for miles back from the river, you then had a really good nature reserve. And round the edges, it was all defended against the slash and burn and all those people. So actually, within the big plantations, you had a good chance of looking after really good habitat. And in such places, orangutan actually coming back. You would also look at the way the mills were done, which are highly polluting, and how the workforce was employed. And then you had a package on how to do a halfway decent palm oil operation. Next one. This is the opposite of palm oil, and this is another agroforestry one. And this is the shea nut, which is in here. I was working in Ghana, and these trees are wild African trees, the shea nut tree. And they have a fruit which is extremely, if you've ever bought shea butter in a sort of cosmetics shop in the UK, that kind of thing, that's what it comes from. And these shea nut lands are in a great band on the sort of north of the equator, but south of the Sahara, right across Africa. And they are marvelous places. Wonderful birds, lots of other gorgeous trees of a different kind, all with them. Next one. And they're jolly valuable. So when I was working with the communities, the old chief said the big thing was the shea nut. And they actually needed the roads, which normally go in and destroy areas to get their market out. And they, like other people, would actually defend their shea nut trees and that habitat to the teeth. Because look at the money they were getting, and that was the motive. So those are the cunning ways of doing it. Next one. And you find that in that habitat, the different trees here, marvelous, gorgeous grasses, and the cattle come in, the nomadic people come down from the north and graze underneath, and so do elephants. And so it's a very rich habitat, but productive. It isn't a wilderness, it's used, it's earning money for the communities. Next one. And my favorite almost, because I partly grew up in Trinidad, is the cocoa. These are a couple of cocoa pods. And the cocoa tree is the most lovely thing. It's about typically the size of a hazel tree, and it grows a sub-story in rainforest. It needs shade. So, and it's always grown over with mosses and orchids, and the birds in it are fabulous. Next one. You get trogons and all those kind of things. So absolutely super. And it's the cocoa farmers, like the shea nut farmers, who defend their rainforests to the teeth from wandering slash and burn, because they depend on the cocoa being in the shade of the other trees in order to be very successful. And then you get green and black and all those companies going in and marketing it as a sustainable crop, and you suddenly turn the whole thing around. Next one. And there's another, almost my favorite of the agroforestry that I came across. There'll be lots of what I've never seen. I'm just talking about things I've seen. And this is the rice paddies. This is the rice bamboo landscape. You know, often landscapes are made of certain plants which are the core of them and are just marvelous. In the South Downs of England, William Cobbett, who was cantering around Hampshire and places, talked about the chalk and cheese landscapes, the chalk on the hill where the sheep grazed, and the cheese in the wet, moist valley bottoms where the cattle grazed in the damp bottoms. And this is a beautiful landscape, but it's entirely productive. And in the background is the grass. There is the rice. That's the rice paddy, and then the rice has to grow in water, and they put the fish in the rice paddy, so they get a second crop. And the fish themselves, their poo adds the nutrients, and they oxygenate the water too, and the rice thrives with the fish, which is another product. Next one. And you'll find there's more bamboo. The bamboo is set. They have not got the most space possible. They cunningly put the bamboo as trellis over the water. And that means that there's space for them to grow all these cucurbits, melons, gourds, which are full of vitamins, vitamin A and so on, over the rice paddy. Next one. And marvelously, there's a bird which is known as the bird on the stick, a drongo, and they always put sticks in the middle of the rice paddy, so that the bird has a perching place, and they fly out, sally out, and they're really after all the insects and the vicious caterpillars which eat the rice. So there's a real partnership there, which is just a local tradition. How much it really makes a difference to the coffee, I don't know, but it's very charming. Next one. And so here you have this marvelous landscape, and you can see the building at the back. The thatch is made of rice, and then the pillars that support it and the frame are bamboo. And the boy in the front left is look, he's got the vegetables which grow on the right on the bamboo trellis, and that little box thing is a fish trap made of split bamboo. I have one here in my study, hanging on the wall. And so the bamboo is used for countless things. It's used for bowls and for scaffolding, for musical instruments, and all that kind of thing. So tremendous, a truly sustainable working landscape. If only all the world was like that, but we know that. Yeah, alas. Bye. Next one. So to sum up on all these clever things, certification. Certificare is the Latin for to make sure. And so a long time ago, a good 20 plus years ago, the first big certification scheme came in with Forest Stewardship Council, FSC. And you'll find on most books, and the paper is FSC certified. You'll find it with that little logo. And that's all very brilliant. And so you can do all this. I have to say, so this has to be one of the answers. People understand. The same with the palm oil. They certify it, and if you can find it's complicated, but if the grower thinks he can get more money for the certified palm oil, he'll be tempted. Having said that, it's still got a long way to go. And the big problem with, as you'll find if you work your way down through this, is what does it mean and how do you know? So there's all sorts of glitches and things. Are you sure it's done properly? And how do you define it? And all that kind of thing. I mean, when the peat was first in attack from the likes of us, they put this peat, you can buy this because it doesn't come out of a British site of special scientific interest or nature reserve. Well, that would be illegal anyhow. So how crafty is that? So you have to be quite canny with all this, but it has to be the way forward. And people like Greenpeace and that have been criticized some of it, but are working with it as well. The whole thing about certification. Next one. Now, Africa, where I was born. And this is a terrible story. If any of you know Africa, the shambas. Shamba is a Swahili word for a vegetable garden. And all the little settlements like this, they call them shambas, particularly in East Africa. But they're all over Africa under different names. And you can see here bananas, some sugarcane on the left. You'll find a bit of sisal maybe for rope, and pawpaw trees, the odd grapefruit, the kind of thing, avocados, very much pawpaws. And over in the back on the right, eucalyptus, which will be useful for the timber. So the folks are growing their own, what they need on these little patches. Unfortunately, they never have title to the road, to the land, because there isn't a proper title system in most of Africa. It's people have always been there and they don't have legal deeds. So that's when the trouble begins. Next one. The wildlife on a shamba, marvelous. This is gloriosa, which any of you have ever grown this in your conservatories or greenhouses. Is a very lovely thing. Grows around these places like bindweed in an allotment. And there are lots of other lovely birds and insects on a shamba because it's low intensity cultivation. Next one. And to add to the glories of the African landscape, you have the marvelous values that people have. Now, I mean, you'll know this. Africa is extremely Christian. I mean, they're very much more Christian devoted than they are mostly in the UK. And you don't ever admit that you don't believe in this kind of thing in Africa. But they also have parallel belief in the natural world, slightly more formalized than we do. So this fabulous tree, which I came across in Ghana, has got a string round it to show that it is worshipped. And at the bottom of the roots, there's a tin bowl on the right-hand side, just above the word Ghana, that was full of goat's blood sacrificed, propitiation to the ancient trees. And you'll find these trees and stones are all over the place. So really, Africa is like a great Stonehenge of magic objects of the natural world, worshipped or venerated. And the only difference being Stonehenge is the Druids are still there. Next one. Now, this is the same picture as you saw before. This is no accident, because this is what what is happening in Africa to those kind of places. It's being turned into another enormous monoculture. In this, I've shown you, and that is one of the awful things about landscape development, is that the world comes to look the same. The same road, the same bridge, the same agribusiness. It's all, the individuality and sense of place is ironed out. And so in Africa, this has been the great land grab. The people are unable to defend themselves because they don't have the papers to show that they own it. And this has happened in the past. It happened in England in the 17th century with the drainage fens, and the same arguments were used. Oh, the poor people, they're so poor. Oh, isn't this land underused? Let's help them and make it productive. And hence the drainage of the fens, and then the fen people were chucked out. In Africa, this is what is happening for monocultures of cereals in the sort of Zimbabwe kind of area. That's just right for barley. And then you've got, or not barley, but some of the cereals. You've got sugarcane, which is a terrible crop as a monoculture because it's very thirsty, pineapples, biomass crops. And the arguments being, oh, they need help, you see. Well, that hasn't worked out that way because the folks are then departing and the money is going into the hands of larger people. And who are they? Well, everybody says thinks it's the Chinese. Chinese are very keen on minerals in Africa. They do lots of mining and wicked things. But the people who are doing this, the great African land grab, are the Americans, more than that, the Europeans. And they say, and there's a big study done by a man called Lorenzo Cotula at Glasgow University, the British. And the big British farmers are buying up land because it's terribly cheap and turning out big crops and making nice profits. So that is the great African land grab. And they reckon in 2008 to 9, an area, the whole of Pakistan was grabbed into outsiders, intensive monoculture cropping. I'm told by Lorenzo that it's now reducing, so touch wood, it may be not as bad as it was. What a tale. Anyway, next one. So this always gets people very excited. It did at Barbara's summer school. Land use is a swallower, and a great cry is always, food security, help. If we don't go on, we've heard it a lot from the recent things and I have sympathy with the farmers recently about all this thing about in England, the wills and what are the taxes. I mean, some of them jolly well do need taxing, but it depends on the size. But the great cry is food security, you must, otherwise we'll all starve to death. Well, it's not true. You can actually import food much cheaper to England than you can grow it, because the prairies of Canada produce, which has been a real problem for English farmers because the Canadian wheat's much cheaper and undercuts them. And it was ever thus. That happened in the 1870s when the prairies were ploughed. The British farmers were on the back foot because of imports. And so there's all that kind of issue. But the biggest one, possibly, another one is for people to not eat meat, because most of this agribusiness cereals goes for cattle feed. It doesn't go for your cornflakes. It goes to feed the cattle. But one of the most interesting things is laboratory grown food. And you put your your piece of meat in a thing called a bioreactor, and with the right ingredients and energy. You've got to give it energy. So in the old days, your crop had the energy from the sun. So you've got to feed in energy from things like wind farms, ideally. It's not to do it off the electricity grid, but to do it with you can easily do it with solar panels and so on. And then you can do this, and the cells divide in the bioreactor, and you can actually, it's the same stuff. It's just the same stuff. So if your meat was decent to start with, and I know a lady who, American, because it's around in America now, the Millennium Burger. And she explained to me that she had tried it. She didn't like it because she simply couldn't tell the difference between it and meat. And as far as she was concerned, meat was revolting. So this is a big change. And they can do lots of things with it, not just meat. It's just arrived in UK as cat food, because people feel that the public will be horrified at eating that way. I think it's rather like everything else. It will the money to be made on it is huge, and it's like the very first computer rearing its head. It'll have the usual, set of good and bad results, which you can never quite predict. But it's coming, and it could be one of the ways. And you could do palm, you could do endless things in this approach, and you could also put your things that are like a sort of the lab. It would look like a kind of gasometer, or where you see a brewery, say. It is because it's kind of brewing. It is that kind of thing. Near a city, and then you can get all. So there's a whole story coming here, and it therefore is the biggest change to actually grow food without farmers. First, that's the biggest revolution since the Fertile Crescent in the Euphrates back in 9000 BC. Watch this space, but I don't think I'm going to live to see it take off fully, but it's starting. Next one. And so here we are. Remember him. So this was the whole business of flooding in the UK, and this was when Mr. Cameron. Oh no, back there. Mr. Cameron was Prime Minister, and they were joking about him not having enough Wellington boots to go to the Somerset levels. I like the reflection. It's just a lovely man who does those cartoons in the Times. You see, we feel your pain, vote Tory. And so basically, bless his cotton socks, under his various we got Brexit, didn't we? And that was in, if one can remember it, 2016. Now, the great driver, I mean, I didn't vote for it, and many people think it's awful and so on. And I think that's terrible. It was shocking. But basically, one of the silver linings is we did get rid of the common agricultural policy. And that had been going since the 70s, and it's still there in Europe. And it was a drive to produce more food, which is all very best intentioned stuff, but it was also then, as it took off, the driver for the intensification. All those big cereal farms I showed you, the CAP, was the real one that drove the hedges. All you have to do, and I think it's not gone quite yet, it's phasing out. The Labour are speeding the phase out, so it might have gone before 2028. All you had to do was to fill in your form with the area of land, so many hectares, and your address, and they would send you the money. And the kind of money that came out always out of Europe, there was 3 billion a year for farmers, which was 55% of their income. So they get half as much again, just handed out, just for being there. And that really, unsurprisingly, led to the draining of marshes and the bulldozing of hedges galore. And so with this, I mean, irony of ironies, in 2019, under Boris Johnson, the Queen's speech set out, there'd been a lot of work behind the scenes, professors at Oxford and stuff saying, if you're going to pay the farmers, we don't mind paying the farmers, but it's public money. They're going to pay the farmers public money, fine, but they have got to do something in return to earn that public money rather than put every penny of it into their pockets. So you have to have a whole range of schemes where they can do set aside bits of land, doing the kind of thing we saw on that Allerton project and being paid to do that. So there's a raft. I'm working at the moment, although I'm meant to be retired, on a big project in Northamptonshire with Natural England. And we're talking to the landowners, and they're really going for these big payments, which are being ramped up next year with ELMS, Environmental Land Management Scheme. So we hope this will seriously change the way in which the English and British landscape is looked after. And it's not rocket science, really, at all. Okay. Devil's going to be in the detail and all that, but it has survived people like Liz Truss, who was going to abolish environmental impact assessment. And the Labour Party seems keen, though, who knows, with this latest row with all their rage and farmers' rage and fury, whether Starmer would bring some of that back. So we're keeping our fingers crossed, not, but that they are helped in ways, but which do not destroy the landscape. Next one. And this is a little site just to show what you can do. This was in Yorkshire, and I was doing a big pipeline, and I had a big meeting at a pub with all the farmers. Anyone got some land which they would like to take out of farming? And a chap, deadly silence, and then a chap said, yeah, I will. And he was a farmer up by the Tees, up in North Yorkshire, and he had this land that was a basin. And I haven't got the picture of it before, but it had sheep growing on it, and it was an old mere. And this mere had been typically drained, pump drained, and was under rather bad grass management for sheep. I couldn't believe it, because in the back of it was this medieval peel tower. So there was even a castle. And this place, he took me there, and we found the money from lottery, and we paid for him to have compensatory land on the hill, and he was very keen, so he stayed as the warden manager of this place. We turned off the pump, and within 2 years the mere was back, and now there are wild cranes on it, and there's breeding godwit that was there thousands of years ago. They looked at the cores under this area. Hull University looked at it, and they found evidence that this mere had been there all back in the periglacial, in the period between the two glaciers of the Ice Age. It had been there, and because they could look at they analysed the cores at the bottom of that little basin, and now it was back to that, and the same birds, the godwits flying in from Iceland. So, well, what about that? Next one. And so finally, going back to my river days, the thing about nature is that it is so rewarding, and people love it. I mean, I found the digger drivers and the engineers and the farmers, not all of them, but were onto it. And of course, the public has a huge groundswell of interest in these things. My grandson is mad on it, and so is David Attenborough. You know, it's everybody's. It's really come into its own, and it is so rewarding. One remembers the planning committees and going out. Well, do come on the site. You know that if you take them on the site visit, that will be what catches them, and they'd go out in the pouring rain and wind, come back with a gleam of determination in their eyes to save this or that little site. It was that which catches you. And I remember haggling in my river days with a farmer to stop them filling in a bend of a meander. And oh, go on, you know, and, oh, well, the land would be valuable. So, and then suddenly the kingfisher shot down the river. He turned to me and he said, "You win," with a shrug and a laugh. That bird saved our bargain. Okay, I think there's just one left, possibly. And that's my book, which you can look up if you want to find it. It's paperback or hardback, and it's there with all this stuff in it. Okay, it's not far. We're just about an hour. We've just gone over.